Hi everyone, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin for P6 Advanced Taxation. And the subject matter for this screencast is employed or self-employed. Now you may remember from our studies that we have a simple mnemonic, MICE ran, under this heading. And those factors, just to take you through them, are mutual obligation, integration, control, equipment, risk, ability to substitute, and number of paymasters or number of clients. Now, this area is historically quite important because of the fact that you will see individuals perhaps purporting to be self-employed and therefore subject to the self-employed or sole trader tax rules, for example, deductibility of expenses, rather than employed and therefore unable to deduct any expenses and certainly subject to a slightly more rigid regime. So what you'll get, more often than not, is a situation where someone is perhaps benefiting from classing themselves as a self-employed person rather than an employed person. And it may well be, and certainly seen this in practice, that some employers sort of collude in the arrangement, and perhaps that may well be because of the PRSI hit on salaries or on the gross invoice, as it were. So it's something that the revenue do look for, and over and above that, I think what you'll find across the board in these factors is that sort of old master-servant relationship. In other words, who's the master, who's the servant? And in an employment situation where someone is employed as opposed to self-employed, you would really expect this sort of, the employer to be the master, to dictate what goes on and to set down sort of rules and regs and procedures, and perhaps it'd be a little bit looser for a self-employed person. So I'll take you through some of these factors now. The first one that we come up to is this idea of control. In other words, who has control in relation to the relationship? And you would suggest that in an employed situation, generally speaking, everything would be controlled by the employer. Yeah, and a self-employed person, on the other hand, would be perhaps able to have a little bit more flexibility as to sort of how and when the service is performed. Perhaps they could substitute another person in. So bear in mind that with all of this, we're looking at the sort of balance of probabilities. In other words, no one factor is conclusive, and the revenue would look at all the factors and then make up their mind in relation to the individual status. Okay. Another point here, just in relation to sort of employee rights, things like sort of sickness and holiday pay. If they were in play in a question, you'd have to think to yourself, well, that's slightly unusual for a self-employed person to have sickness and holiday pay, and perhaps even redundancy. So in that case, that would sort of lend itself towards sort of employment rather than self-employment. Okay. Next one here is just this idea of payments being sort of based on results rather than on a time basis. And what you would expect there is that if those sorts of things were in play, more of a sort of an indicator of self-employment rather than employment. So again, you'll see that, and I would expect in a question on the day of the exam, that you have a slightly more sort of meaty scenario than you have in this particular question. So you've got to look at all the factors and see whether or not they're in play or not. I mean, bear in mind, as I said in the badges of trade screencast, that it may well be that one factor really isn't in play, and so say that in your answer. This factor is not particularly relevant in this case. Okay. Now, next point here, we have this idea of flexibility. In other words, how flexible is the arrangement in relation to hours of work? I mean, you'll know from your own employment situation that hours are generally set for an employee, whereas a self-employed person, it may well be that they can choose the time and perhaps even choose the hours relevant to carrying out the job. So flexibility would tend to sort of lend itself towards sort of self-employment rather than employment. Okay, we'll just move down to the next set of factors here under our heading. These are the last sort of few. As you'll see, there's quite a few more than I think they've asked for 5, but they've given quite a few more than that. This aspect here, risk. What you'll find is that for a self-employed person, there is a certain degree of risk involved, and not so much for an employed person. So just remember that area of is the person taking risk? Do they stand to sort of profit from that risk? And the degree of risk, or at least a high degree of risk, would sort of tend to lend itself towards someone being self-employed rather than employed. Next one, number 6 here, you'll see we're talking about equipment, and the factor that or the example that I tend to give in classes is that you're not required when you arrive at work on Monday morning at 9 o'clock to bring your desk and your chair and your computer with you. And that's because that's what is expected in an employment situation. Whereas a self-employed person would be inclined to have to bring their sort of tools of trade with them in order to perform the task. So again, that type of factor would lend itself towards sort of employment, as it were, if the equipment is provided. Okay. Next one here under the heading of I for integration. It's really how far the individual is integrated into the business. Compare perhaps a consultant who's self-employed, who sits on the board and is in 4 days a week, 9 to 5, who's really helping the business to move forward on a strategic level, to perhaps a cleaner coming in once a month, who's more integrated into the business, and really who should be seen as being sort of employed. Okay. Next one here, the degree of exclusivity in the relationship. Certainly an employee is provided with work and is required to attend work, probably Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and it's unlikely that they would be working for other employers. And I've seen that sort of work in reverse, in fact, in relation to self-employed people trying to sort of purport to be self-employed, where they really only have sort of one main client and they're there 40, 50 hours a week. So that's something that someone in that position needs to watch out for. Okay, the number of clients and the degree of exclusivity in the relationship. Okay, just scroll on here so that we can see a little bit further down. Last one here is really the first one, M, the obligation, the obligation to provide work and the obligation to do work. And really that is something that's in play in relation to an employer or employee situation. So, watch for that. An employee can't really decline work. A self-employed person can indeed. They're probably unlikely to, but they can decline work. Whereas an employee is required to work. There's an obligation to provide work to the employee, and there's an obligation for the employee to do the work. So mutual obligation is something that is important in this scenario. Okay, hopefully that's a helpful, if not brief, summary on this area, and I hope that it may help you if this area comes up on the day of the exam. Many thanks.